The night had a way of shrinking space, pulling people closer than they intended, and I realized that too late, right when I said it. "Take off your jacket." My voice came out lower than I expected, quieter too, like the words weren't meant to travel far. We were standing under a flickering streetlight that hummed softly above us, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else goes silent. She looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to laugh or step back, and the distance between us, what little remained, felt suddenly dangerous. The air smelled like rain and old pavement, and her jacket was zipped up to her chin as if she'd been hiding behind it all evening. I hadn't meant it the way it sounded, or maybe I had, and that realization hit me all at once. The world seemed to hold its breath. She hesitated, fingers still hooked into the sleeves, eyes searching my face for an answer I hadn't given out loud. We hadn't planned to be here, hadn't planned to talk this long, hadn't planned anything beyond a casual meeting that somehow stretched into hours. Yet here we were, close enough to feel each other's warmth, close enough to hear the change in breathing, close enough to know that something was shifting. I could have stepped back. I didn't. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, heart pounding louder than the streetlight's hum, aware that one move, one word, could change how this night would be remembered forever. She slowly unzipped the jacket, not taking her eyes off me, and in that small motion I felt something loosen inside my chest. This wasn't about the cold anymore. It was about the moment. About everything we hadn't said yet. And as the jacket slipped from her shoulders, I realized some moments don't ask for permission, they just happen, and you either lean into them, or spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you had. She folded the jacket over her arm, and suddenly there was nothing between us, not fabric, not excuses, not the careful distance we'd kept all evening. The street felt quieter now, like the city itself had turned away to give us privacy. I became acutely aware of how close we were standing, how the space between us had collapsed without either of us stepping forward. Her eyes softened, then sharpened, as if she'd reached a decision she'd been circling all night. I wanted to say something clever, something safe, but moments like this don't belong to clever words, they belong to honesty. The kind that makes your chest feel tight and your hands unsure of what to do with themselves. I could feel the heat from her skin, the rhythm of her breathing syncing with mine, and it struck me how fragile this instant was. One interruption, one step back, and it would vanish. She tilted her head slightly, just enough to change the angle of the world, and I understood then that closeness isn't measured in inches, it's measured in courage. In choosing not to run. In choosing to stay present. The night didn't explode into anything dramatic, there were no grand gestures, no dramatic confessions shouted into the dark. Just two people standing too close together, realizing that sometimes the most powerful connections happen quietly. As we finally stepped apart, not because we wanted to but because we knew we should, the moment stayed with us, unbroken, unresolved, alive. And I knew that if someone was listening to this story right now, feeling that same pull, that same recognition of a moment they never forgot, then this channel was for them. Because stories like these aren't just told, they're felt. If this moment touched something inside you, if you've ever stood too close to someone and felt your whole world shift, then subscribe to the channel. There are more stories waiting, stories that remind us how powerful a single moment can be, and how sometimes, all it takes is one sentence, to change everything that we didn't say goodbye properly that night, not in the way people do when they're sure they'll see each other again, and not in the way they do when they know they won't. It was something unfinished, hanging in the air like the warmth her jacket had left behind. And as I walked away I kept replaying the moment over and over, wondering when exactly it had stopped being casual and started becoming something that followed me home. Days passed, ordinary on the surface, but altered underneath, because once you stand that close to someone and feel the shift, the world doesn't quite fit the same way again. I found myself noticing small things I'd ignored before, the way silence can feel loud, the way memory can press against your chest at the most inconvenient times, the way a single sentence can become a doorway you keep standing in long after the moment has passed. When she finally messaged me, it wasn't dramatic, just a simple line asking if I'd been cold that night, and yet my heart reacted as if she'd said everything at once. We met again, this time in daylight, which should have made things safer, clearer, easier to define, but instead it stripped away the mystery and replaced it with something more dangerous: familiarity. We laughed more easily, spoke more openly, and still, inevitably, ended up standing too close, as if our bodies remembered something our words were trying to avoid. There was no jacket this time, no excuse to bridge the distance, yet the pull was stronger, because now we both knew what it felt like to almost cross that line. I realized then that the hardest moments aren't the ones where something happens, but the ones where something could, and you're forced to sit with that possibility, to decide whether you're brave enough to step forward or disciplined enough to step back. As we parted again, with promises that sounded casual but felt weighted, I understood that this story wasn't just about proximity or attraction, it was about timing, about choices, about the quiet tension that shapes us long after the moment itself has ended. And if you're listening to this right now, recognizing pieces of your own life in these words, then you already know why these stories matter. They remind us that the smallest moments often carry the greatest weight. If you want to keep exploring stories like this, stories about connection, restraint, and the moments that stay with us, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because this isn't just a story you hear once, it's one you feel, and it doesn't end here. The truth finally caught up with us on a night that felt ordinary at first, the kind of evening you don't expect to remember, which is often how the most important ones begin. And as we stood facing each other again, familiar place, familiar distance, familiar tension, I realized how much space a heart can hold when it's been waiting. We talked about everything except the thing that mattered, circling it carefully, pretending the past weeks hadn't been charged with glances that lingered too long and silences that said too much, until she finally stopped mid-sentence and looked at me the same way she had under that streetlight, like she was deciding whether to step forward or turn away. This time, neither of us pretended not to notice how close we were standing. There was no jacket, no cold, no excuse at all, just choice. I felt the weight of all the moments that had led us here, every almost, every pause, every restrained impulse, and I understood that whatever happened next would define how we remembered each other. When she spoke, her voice was steady but honest, and in that honesty the tension finally softened into something real, something grounded, something that didn't need to rush. We didn't collapse into drama or promises. Instead, we chose clarity, acknowledging what we felt without letting it consume us, and that choice, quiet, deliberate, felt more powerful than any impulsive move ever could. As we stepped back this time, It wasn't out of fear but respect, and in that space I felt a strange peace, knowing that some connections don't fade even when they don't become what we imagine. They stay with us as markers of who we were in that moment of becoming. And if you've stayed with this story until now, it means you understand that kind of ending, the kind that doesn't shout, but resonates. Stories like these aren't about perfection, they're about truth, about recognizing the moments that shape us and honoring them for what they are. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you once stood too close to, then subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting here, stories that feel like memories, moments, and quiet revelations, and the next one might be closer to your own life than you expect. Time didn't resolve what happened between us, it refined it, sanding down the sharp edges until what remained was something quieter but deeper, something that lived beneath the surface of everyday life. And I learned that some connections don't ask to be defined, they ask to be carried. Weeks turned into months, and although our lives moved forward in visible ways, there was always that invisible thread pulling gently whenever our paths crossed or our names appeared unexpectedly on a screen. We spoke less, but when we did, every word felt deliberate, weighted with everything we weren't saying, and I noticed how even ordinary conversations carried an undercurrent of awareness, as if we both knew that we were speaking around a shared memory rather than directly into the present. I would catch myself thinking of that first night, not the closeness itself, but the restraint, the moment we both recognized what was happening and chose not to rush it, and I realized how rare that kind of mutual understanding is, how most people spend their lives mistaking intensity for meaning, while what truly stays is the moments handled with care. When we met again after a long gap, it felt different, not colder, not distant, just settled, like two people who had already crossed an invisible threshold and didn't need to test it again. We stood side by side instead of face to face, our shoulders almost touching but not quite, and I understood then that closeness doesn't always demand proximity, sometimes it lives in shared silence, in the comfort of not needing to prove anything. As we talked about where life had taken us, about changes that felt both exciting and heavy, I saw how that moment under the streetlight had quietly shaped us both, teaching us something about patience, about timing, about respecting the power of what almost happened. When we finally said goodbye this time, it felt complete, not because the story had ended, but because it had become part of who we were, no longer asking questions, no longer pulling at us, simply existing as a meaningful chapter we could carry without regret. Walking away, I felt grateful, not for what we could have been, but for what we were in that moment of honesty, and I realized that some stories aren't meant to escalate, they're meant to resonate. And if you're still here, listening, feeling the weight of these quiet moments, then you already understand why stories like this matter. They remind us that life isn't just shaped by dramatic choices, but by the subtle ones, the pauses, the restraint, the respect we show ourselves and others. If this story stayed with you, if it felt like a memory rather than a tale, then subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are waiting, stories about connection, timing, and the moments that change us without making a sound. There are moments in life that don't announce their importance when they arrive, they slip in quietly, settle somewhere deep inside you, and only much later do you realize they rewired the way you understand closeness, choice, and yourself, and that was what our story had become for me. Long after the tension faded and the conversation slowed, I noticed how that single night kept resurfacing, not as longing, but as clarity. It showed up in how I handled new connections, how I paused before speaking, how I learned to read the space between words as carefully as the words themselves. I stopped chasing intensity for the sake of feeling alive and started valuing steadiness, respect, and the courage it takes to not rush something just because it feels powerful. Sometimes I'd pass places that reminded me of her, the kind of coincidences that make you slow your steps without meaning to, and instead of feeling regret, I felt grounded, as if that chapter had quietly taught me how to stand more firmly in my own life. I realized that not every meaningful connection is meant to turn into a lifelong story. Some exist to teach you how to recognize one when it truly arrives. When I eventually met someone new, I carried that lesson with me, noticing how I no longer feared silence, how I allowed moments to unfold instead of forcing them, how I understood that real closeness doesn't need constant proof. And every so often, in the stillness of an ordinary evening, I'd think back to that streetlight, that jacket, that space we closed and then respected, and I'd feel grateful, not because it was unresolved, but because it was handled with care. That gratitude became a quiet confidence, a reminder that I could trust myself with moments that mattered. Stories like this don't end with dramatic finales, they echo, shaping decisions you don't even realize you're making, becoming part of the lens through which you see the world. And if you're listening right now, recognizing pieces of your own past in this reflection, then you already know why these stories stay with us. They remind us that growth often comes from the moments we didn't rush, the choices we made when no one was watching. If this story resonated with you, if it felt like something you've lived rather than something you've heard, then subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming, stories that linger, that teach, and that remind us how powerful quiet moments can be. That I didn't expect the memory to return the way it did, soft, uninvited, almost gentle, on a night that had nothing to do with her and yet somehow led straight back to that same understanding, the one forged in the space we never crossed. I was standing alone this time, watching people move past each other in hurried lines, brushing shoulders without ever really meeting, and it struck me how rare it is for two people to truly notice the moment they're in. Most of us are either reaching forward or looking back, rarely present enough to feel the weight of now. That was the gift our story had given me, awareness. I could feel it in the way I now recognized when a moment was asking something of me, not action, not restraint, but attention. I thought about how easily that night could have tipped into something impulsive, something intense but fleeting, and how choosing awareness instead had allowed it to become something lasting in a different way. As life continued unfolding, I found myself passing that lesson on without words, showing it through how I listened, how I stayed when things felt uncertain instead of filling the silence with noise. Every meaningful connection I formed after that carried a trace of that understanding, as if the echo of that closeness had become part of my emotional vocabulary. Even when loneliness crept in, and it did, quietly, like it always does, I no longer mistook it for a signal to settle or rush. I recognized it as space, and space, I had learned, isn't always something to fear. It can be an invitation to grow, to reflect, to prepare. Looking back, I understood that the power of that moment wasn't in what we denied ourselves, but in what we gained, a deeper respect for timing, for boundaries, for the way restraint can be just as intimate as touch. And if you're still listening to this story, feeling its slow rhythm, its quiet pull, then you understand too. These stories aren't meant to overwhelm, they're meant to stay. If this chapter resonated with you, if it felt like a mirror held gently in front of your own experiences, then subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are waiting, stories that speak softly, but stay with you long after the words end. By the time I realized the story had fully settled into me, it no longer felt like something that belonged to the past, it felt like a compass, subtle but steady, guiding the way I moved through new moments with a quiet confidence I hadn't known before. I noticed how I no longer rushed toward certainty or ran from ambiguity, how I could stand inside unanswered questions without needing them resolved immediately, and I traced that patience back to the night when closeness taught me more than action ever could. Life kept presenting opportunities to repeat old patterns, to step too fast, to fill space just to avoid feeling it, but each time, I felt that memory gently intervening, reminding me that meaning isn't measured by speed or intensity, but by presence. When connections ended or changed, I didn't cling the way I once might have. I allowed them to take their proper shape, understanding that not every bond is meant to last forever to be significant. Sometimes, in quiet conversations with people who felt safe, I found myself speaking about moments that almost became something else, and I watched how their expressions softened in recognition, because nearly everyone carries at least one story like that, one moment that taught them who they were becoming. That realization made me feel less alone, more connected to the invisible network of human experiences we rarely articulate. The memory of her wasn't a shadow or a regret, it was a reference point, a reminder that I was capable of handling closeness with care, of honoring both desire and restraint without betraying either. And standing in that understanding, I felt ready, for whatever connection came next, whether it arrived gently or all at once. If you're listening right now and this chapter feels familiar, like something you've lived rather than heard, then this space was made for you. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories that move at the pace of real emotion, stories about timing, growth, and the quiet moments that shape who we become without ever asking for attention. The story finally revealed its quiet purpose on a day that carried no significance on the calendar, no anniversary, no reminder, just an ordinary stretch of time that suddenly felt illuminated by understanding. I was sitting alone, watching light move slowly across the room, and it occurred to me that some moments are meant to arrive early in our lives, not to give us answers, but to prepare us for the questions that matter later. What happened between us had done exactly that. It taught me how to recognize depth without mistaking it for urgency, how to honor emotion without letting it rush me into choices I wasn't ready to stand by. I realized I no longer measured connection by how intense it felt in the beginning, but by how steady it remained when novelty faded. That shift changed everything. Relationships stopped feeling like tests and started feeling like conversations, ongoing, evolving, patient. Even when I thought of her now, there was no ache attached, only appreciation, the kind you feel for a lesson that arrived wrapped in warmth rather than pain. It struck me how rare that is, how many people carry memories that bruise instead of build, and I felt grateful that ours had become a source of clarity rather than conflict. As the day moved on and the light shifted again, I understood that this story had already given me what it was meant to give, and anything beyond that would have been excess. And if you've stayed with this story through all these chapters, feeling its slow unfolding, then you already understand its truth. Some stories aren't meant to climax, they're meant to mature. If this chapter resonated with you, if it echoed something quietly meaningful in your own life, then subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming, stories that don't rush, that don't shout, and that stay with you long after the moment passes. The last thing I learned from that night came to me not as a thought, but as a feeling, steady, grounded, and calm, like standing with both feet planted after a long walk in uncertain weather, and it made me realize that some moments don't push us forward or pull us back, they center us. Long after the faces blurred and the details softened, what remained was the sense of alignment it gave me, the quiet assurance that I could trust my instincts without being ruled by them. I noticed how this understanding shaped even the smallest interactions, how I approached people with less urgency and more intention, how I allowed conversations to breathe instead of forcing them toward conclusions. Life didn't suddenly become simpler, but it became clearer, and clarity, I learned, is far more valuable than certainty. Every now and then, I would catch myself standing a little closer to someone new, feeling that familiar spark of awareness, and instead of reacting, I'd pause, present, open, unafraid, and that pause became a choice, not a hesitation. Looking back, I no longer saw that moment under the streetlight as something unfinished, but as something complete in its own way, a turning point that didn't need a dramatic outcome to justify its importance. And if you're listening to this now, at the end of this story, feeling its quiet weight settle, then you've already taken something from it, a reminder that your most meaningful moments might be the ones that taught you how to stand still. If this story walked with you, if it felt honest and human, then subscribe to the channel. More stories are waiting here, stories about the spaces between people, the choices we make in silence, and the moments that shape us without ever asking to be named. By the time chapter 11 unfolded in my memory, I realized the story had grown beyond two people standing too close under a streetlight. It had become a map of understanding, of noticing, and of the quiet, subtle power of restraint. Life had continued in its usual rhythm, yet the echoes of that night followed me everywhere, in small moments I hadn't anticipated. A sudden glance from a stranger, a pause in a conversation, the way light fell across a room, all of it carried traces of that closeness we once shared, and I understood that some experiences aren't bound to time or place. They exist in memory and feeling, shaping how we perceive connection, intimacy, and presence. I began to see the difference between attraction and understanding, between desire and respect, and I realized how easily the former can blind us if we ignore the lessons the latter brings. The night with her had taught me that closeness doesn't require movement, that connection doesn't demand immediate expression, and that restraint, when paired with awareness, can be as powerful as action itself. I noticed it in myself, in the way I approached new friendships, in the way I listened longer before speaking, in the way I allowed spaces to exist without trying to fill them unnecessarily. It was a subtle transformation, invisible to everyone but me, yet it felt like a quiet revolution inside. One afternoon, months later, I found myself thinking of her, not with longing or regret, but with clarity and gratitude. Gratitude for the moment, for the pause, for the way it had expanded my understanding of life. It was as if that single night had written an instruction manual I hadn't known I needed: how to stand close without pressing, how to be present without forcing, how to recognize importance without clinging. Every relationship that followed carried that silent influence. And if you're listening to this chapter now, feeling that same recognition in your own life, then you understand why these moments matter more than any drama or grand gesture ever could. If this story has touched you, helped you see the quiet power of restraint and awareness, then subscribe to the channel. More stories are coming, stories that linger, stories that teach, and stories that remind us that some of life's most profound lessons arrive not with a shout, but in a gentle, unspoken closeness. By the time chapter 12 came around in my recollections, I realized that the story was no longer just about a jacket, a streetlight, or a single moment of closeness. It had grown into a lesson about awareness, patience, and the quiet power of presence. Life kept moving forward, as it always does, yet in every ordinary day I found traces of that night subtly influencing me, teaching me how to navigate not just relationships, but existence itself. The small moments, the pauses, the spaces between words, they carried meaning I had never noticed before, and I began to see how much of life's richness is hidden in these invisible threads, waiting for attention rather than being seized. I noticed how this awareness shaped the way I engaged with others. I listened more carefully, spoke with intention, and recognized the power of patience in a world obsessed with immediacy. That one night had taught me that closeness is not measured in inches, but in attentiveness, that intimacy is not always in touch, but in understanding, that love, respect, and care often show themselves most profoundly in restraint. With every encounter, I could feel the lesson guiding me, reminding me that every moment, no matter how small, carries the potential to change perspective, if only you choose to notice it. Then came the moments when memories of her returned unexpectedly, not as longing or regret, but as clarity. I would catch myself smiling at a thought, pausing mid-step in a street, or holding my breath during a quiet conversation, recognizing the way presence can transform ordinary seconds into something meaningful. I understood finally that the true gift of that night wasn't the closeness itself, but the awareness it seeded, the ability to recognize what matters, to move deliberately, and to honor connection without forcing it. If you felt that same quiet weight, that subtle but undeniable pull of meaningful moments in your own life, then this story is speaking to you. And if this chapter resonates, if it reminds you of times when restraint, attention, and awareness shaped your choices, then subscribe to the channel. More stories are coming, stories that linger like memories, stories that teach, and stories that reveal the extraordinary in the ordinary moments that define our lives.